Welcome, everyone. Welcome to October. Welcome to the beautiful University Club of Chicago. And most importantly, welcome to our inaugural Harris Lecture of the 2014-15 school year. It's very nice to see all of you here. My name's Elena Harkness. I am an alumna of the Harris School from 2006. I'm a program officer right now at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation here in Chicago. And it's my job to welcome you all here to this lecture, which is one of the kind of key events that we support here at the Harris School. I have the privilege this year of serving as the president of the Harris School's Alumni Council. So this is our third year running, and we're just really excited to see the enthusiasm that's been built by the community and everybody out here to listen to this really important topic. So at MacArthur, it's my job to identify and support evidence-based and data-informed solutions to the challenges facing cities. And one of the greatest challenges right now in Chicago and in cities all over the country is the persistent challenge of the foreclosure crisis. So I'm really excited to have this stellar lineup of speakers here to talk about the solutions that they're crafting to this problem right here in Chicago. We've got among them, I'll let the dean do the introduction, but we're just really thrilled to have them all here. I also want to let you know that this is our first time live webcasting a Harris Lecture. So you're all going to be broadcast not only live to the internet right now, but you'll actually be recorded and you'll be able to see this presentation on the Harris School's YouTube channel after this. So if you have friends who couldn't be here tonight, but you might want to share the program, make sure you let them know about that. And also, for those of you that are tweeting, we are at Chicago Harris, so you can live tweet any of the pearls of wisdom that our panelists drop at any time. One of the main sort of accomplishments of the Harris School's Alumni Council over the last 3 years was to think about how we start engaging alumni and supporting the school in a myriad number of different ways. So one of them was to help support panels and presentations and events like this one. We do them in events we do them in cities all over the country. But another really important accomplishment was to start to deepen the engagement with fundraising for the school. And one of the accomplishments that we're proudest of, I think, is being able to actually raise funds to support a scholarship for a Harris student. And we're very, very privileged to have the first ever Harris Alumni Scholarship recipient here with us tonight. Her name is Annalisa Daniele. She comes to us from the other side of the city, from Northwestern. Annalisa, where are you? Can you raise your hand? Great. So please say hi to Annalisa. We're just so thrilled because this represents an outpouring of alumni support, and we're really encouraged and excited to keep this up and be able to expand this opportunity to future Harris students down the road. If any of you are interested in supporting the Harris Alumni Fund, there will be pledge cards after the event, and you can also come see me or Jody Horowitz at any time if you want to learn about how to get engaged and involved in the Alumni Council. But now it's my pleasure to introduce the new Dean of the Harris School of Chicago and the next generation of leadership, Daniel Diermeyer. Daniel also, like Annalisa, comes to us from the other side of the city, from Northwestern. Previously, he taught at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University and most recently at Kellogg School of Management, where he was the IBM Professor of Regulation and Competitive Practice. He was also the director of the Ford Motor Company Center for Global Citizenship and held appointments in the departments of political science, economics, and linguistics, as well as the School of Law. So this is the kind of interdisciplinary leader that University of Chicago loves to have. We're very excited to have him here. He's also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the Canadian Institute of Advanced Research. He's been an advisor to governments, nonprofits, and leading companies, including Abbott, Accenture, Baxter International, and the City of Chicago, just to name a few. Dean Diermeyer has come to Harris planning to build on the school's already strong foundations and take it to the next level. And I know all of you will join me in welcoming Dean Diermeyer to the stage now to take us through the rest of the program.
Thank you, Elena, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for coming tonight. It's a great pleasure to spend the evening with you today to talk about one of the big policy crises or policy issues that we're all facing. But before we go and talk about that, let me give you a little bit background on myself and why I'm excited to be at Harris at this particular point in time. So, as was mentioned before, I'm kind of a refugee from the north side, but I'm fully entrenched on the south side. It's all there. We live in, my family and I, we live in Hyde Park, so all that's taken care of. And my boys loved the White Sox before we came here, so this is all easy for us, right? This is an easy transition. I can't tell you how excited I am to be at Harris at this particular point in time and at the University of Chicago. So this today is day 2 of week 5 for me, so I'm still kind of counting the weeks and the days. And even though I spent most of the summer talking to many of you, talking to students, talking to alumni, talking to the faculty, talking to the staff, talking to our supporters in the city, the last 4 weeks now have just been incredible. The amount of support that I've seen from various parts of the university, our alumni, supporters in the city, other parts of the university, and within Harris has just been tremendous. And one of the reasons why I was excited about this opportunity was I felt it was really a golden moment for the Harris School. And you have an environment of one of the world's great universities in one of the most vibrant cities on the globe, with many challenges, but with many opportunities. And I think also is that it's a time right now where a lot of pieces really come together. For those of you that have followed what's going on at the U of C over the last few years, you've seen a tremendous amount of energy on a whole variety of areas, but also in areas that are particularly important to us, whether you think about the Institute of Politics or the Paulson Institute, or then, of course, our battle to make sure the Obama Library goes to where it belongs. That means that politics and policy issues are really center stage right now. And the president and the provost and the entire university is focused on this. They have been tremendously supportive over the last few weeks. And I think that with all these pieces together and with an engaged student body, with an engaged alumni body, and with an engaged support that we have both inside of the university, we can take the next step for Chicago Harris. This is a school that has accomplished a lot. There's a lot to be proud of, but I would say we're proud, but we're not satisfied. I think we're ready for the next step. I think a lot of pieces are there, and my commitment to you is that we will work very hard over the next few months and over the next few years to really get us to the next level. But I can't do it without you. No professional school, no university can thrive without a strong alumni body. We're committed to further engaging with you, to helping you form communities among your fellow alumni members, and I will ask for your support over the next few weeks and months. My visiting committee member and good friend, Dennis Keller, always says there are 3 things that we need. We need time, talent, and treasure. And we're going to ask for all 3 for you, right? So I will reach out to you. I want to have your advice. I want to have your input. I want to have your help with telling the Chicago Harris story, with helping identifying internships and placement opportunities. And yes, I will ask for a donation, whether it is for a stipend or the general alumni fund. All these things will be critical for our success. So with that in mind, watch this space. You're going to hear a lot from us in the next few weeks and months. We're just getting started, but we've been off to a terrific start, and I want to thank all of you, especially Elena and the Alumni Council. We had a wonderful phone call meeting combined a couple of weeks ago. Charlie was kind enough to host us. So we're off to a great start there, but there's a lot more to come, and we're just starting to engage in another phase of engaging and connecting our alumni. Now to today's topic. So, of course, this is the University of Chicago, and we can't come together without talking about an important topic in a rigorous fashion. So, what today our topic will be, we'll talk about the consequences really of the foreclosure crisis. You see the theme today, can big data help solve the foreclosure crisis? Now, of course, the foreclosure crisis has a whole variety of negative consequences, whether it is with respect to people that lost their homes or their mortgages. But one of the things that's, I think, less appreciated is that because of abandoned homes, we now have a very large stock of houses that are effectively unoccupied and vacant, with sometimes devastating consequences for the neighborhoods where they're located. Anything from crime to spillover effect on the housing values, it's all a whole variety of things that we have to think about, from public safety to city services to the economic consequences. In Cook County alone, we have about 55,000 abandoned or unoccupied buildings. And this is not just a problem for Chicago, it's a problem for the country overall. Now, in Chicago, we pride ourselves that this is the city that works most of the time, almost always. But we try to think about concrete solutions. And so one of the things that you'll hear about today is a very innovative approach here in Cook County to address this problem, which is the Cook County Land Bank Authority, which basically is a public approach to deal with this broad problem, acquiring distressed properties, maintaining them, keeping them, renovating them, and then selling them again. So that there is a possibility to take from an abandoned property can be brought back to productive use. This is an innovative solution, and it has a whole variety of different dimensions to make it work. One of them just has to do of how do you handle such a large stock of abandoned properties. And for those of you that have followed this a little bit, we have started a couple of years ago the data science for the social good fellowships at Harris. They were funded by Eric and Wendy Schmidt, so they gave a little money for that. And what that allows people to do that have a strong background in data analytics, computational modeling, to come to Chicago in the summer. They're located right there and there. We just saw the summer presentation at 1871 to utilize their tools to find innovative solutions to public policy. And this is really something that we try to do. We try to bring the rigor and the analytical approach to saving public policy problems. Elena kind of said it so nicely before. This is an example of how we do this. And there are many other examples. We have a new master's degree in computational approach and in public policy, and I had the pleasure of talking to 2 of our inaugural students in that degree. So I think that's a wonderful approach. We have a center that does that, and we have a whole variety of other initiatives that really try to write the next chapter of how do we use data in order to solve public policy problems. Our goal today is to apply this approach to the consequences of the foreclosure crisis. And I have next to me a distinguished panel that will enlighten us and share their insights. Immediately to my left, I guess that's on your right, well, right here, next to me, is Ben Keyes. Ben Keyes is associate professor at the Harris School. He is an expert on housing policy. He was, before, in a previous life, staff economist at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, but with a particular interest in thinking about housing financing, mortgages, the regulatory and incentive system that really kind of drives the decision of people to finance and how we can influence that. Then next to him, I guess on my left, one over, right, is Tom Plagge. He is a senior researcher at the University of Chicago Computation Institute and Center for Data Science and Public Policy. So his background, he's a PhD in physics from Cal Berkeley. So he knows how to handle data, how to think about them in a methodological way, and he's now applying his toolkit, his skills, to think about a whole variety of problems, anything from education to public health, in this particular case, housing and community development. And then last but not least is Bridget Gaynor, who is the Cook County Commissioner for the 10th District and chair of the Cook County Land Bank that I just mentioned before. So she has a distinguished career, 20 years of experience in nonprofit, government, and corporate sector. She actually began her career as a community organizer, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. That's good, good. I get nodding there. She has been done working in education. Then she took a little spin in the corporate sector, worked for Aon. You all remember Aon Tower right there, right? They're still there, even though the headquarters are in London now. And she has then been elected to the Cook County Board in 2010, was appointed the first chairwoman of the pension committee, and particularly relevant for our context is she completed the creation of the Cook County Land Bank and has really, the driving force behind this innovative institution. Thank you, panelists, for joining us. It's wonderful that you will share your insights with it, and now I'm going to hand it over to Ben, who will moderate the discussion. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. tonight, and which is the first week of classes at the Harris School. In the winter quarter, I usually teach a course on housing policy, but in the fall, I teach a course on statistics, and my first lecture on statistics yesterday had, in part, the theme of data-driven policymaking, evidence-based policymaking. How do we go from simple policy arguments or policy discussions where people are shouting at one another to actually having some substance and some data behind the arguments that are being made? And before we get to talking about the potential of big data and the foreclosure crisis, I want to talk about big numbers. And the first big number, for those of you who have your phones out and aren't paying attention to me, maybe you're on Twitter, you can tweet this number, $5 trillion, right? $5 trillion is roughly the amount of housing wealth that was lost in this country through the process of the bursting of the housing bubble. Roughly $5 trillion. It's a difficult number to even put into perspective just how large a number that is, but that's the number that we were dealing with at the bottom of the housing bust in 2009 and 2010, right around when I joined the Federal Reserve Board. It's a hard number to grasp, but it's massive. And when we think about the decisions that households have made in the aftermath of the housing bust, we really have to keep that number in mind, that many households not only lost all of their wealth, but they lost their security with the home that they resided in. And a lot of middle-class households in particular have nearly all of their wealth tied up in their homes. And so when we're thinking about this issue, it really is, in particular, a middle-class issue. And I think one of the things that gets overlooked in a lot of the discussions about the housing crisis was just how uneven the housing crisis was felt. And you can see this just driving around the city of Chicago. It's very apparent that some neighborhoods, this has a much more persistent and devastating impact. House prices across the region fell roughly on the order of 25%. In neighborhoods like Englewood, they fell by more than 50%. And if you think about the amount of housing wealth that was wiped out, it's very difficult for households to recover, and that's going to drive a lot of their responses thereafter in terms of walking away from their homes, not maintaining their homes, and so on. From the perspective of the banks, the argument is the same. They've wiped out most of the value of the investment in this property. What do you do when the value of a property is essentially zero, or in some cases negative, right? Because it costs money to tear down the damaged, risky, potentially contaminated building that's already there. This is exactly the area where we as researchers or as policymakers realize that there are some dysfunctions in a traditionally functioning market, and there's room for governments to step in and fill some of that void. We see this with the process of foreclosures, where in Illinois it now takes over 800 days to complete a foreclosure. This is a market that then forces houses to sit stagnant, to sit unoccupied, to deteriorate, to become vacant, to become vandalized. And this is exactly the kind of setting where we as policymakers can step in and improve things. And if you look at the responses more broadly to sort of the national crisis, there were 3 million foreclosures filed in 2010, if you want to think more about some big numbers that can lead to the reasons to look into big data. When we see these kinds of numbers and we look at the responses, because things are so heterogeneous on a local level, national policies are simply not equipped to respond to these things. The foreclosure system is not responding, can't be equipped to respond at a local level. And so what we see is national programs like HAMP and HARP, the mortgage modification programs, the mortgage refinancing programs, that have done actually quite a bit within the confines of what they were designed to do. But then when we're thinking about targeting specific hard-hit neighborhoods, think about these numbers. $7 billion from the NSP program. Another $7 billion from the hardest hit program. These are programs that were targeted to specific neighborhoods, but on the order of magnitude of $5 trillion, those $14 billion had a very small impact. And what we're left with is pockets where the foreclosure crisis and the housing crisis is still being very much felt today, even now 5 years, 6 years after the peak in house prices. And this is where I think the creativity and the initiative of the creation of the Cook County Land Bank, in which Commissioner Gaynor was really a driving force in getting that bill created, the bill to create the land bank, is so crucial. We have a set of policies that simply can't work in all neighborhoods at all times, and so we need to create these other entities that can step in and fill that void. I want to pass the microphone off to Commissioner Gaynor, who's going to talk about the land bank, and then Tom will talk about some of the specifics ways in which we can think about this as a data-driven problem, and some of the work that he's been doing with the data science for the social good. I'm going to follow up with a few questions, but I really do want to have this be a conversation with all of you who have joined us tonight. So we'll quickly turn it over for questions from the audience thereafter. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Commissioner Gaynor. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to the Harris School for hosting this. I always appreciate on a beautiful night that people are willing to come and listen to this issue that's not just important, it's interesting, but it's really vital to the way we think about the future of our city, especially certain communities and their ability to recover and move on and find a new path, even if that path looks different. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of data in public policy decisions broadly, and then talk about how they have focused us at the land bank and how they're actually, helping to determine the decisions we're making going forward. So, I started my career, about 15 years ago, I worked at City Hall. I see some veterans around here from those days. And so, even in this, my limited lifetime, the relationship between government and the public and data was very antagonistic. Things were hard to get, everything was on paper, things were a secret. If you tried to get them, it was often that you were, going after things that you didn't really have the right to see. It's why all of the Freedom of Information Acts and laws were created, because people had no ability to get information that was about their government. We have an interesting, we're kind of on the opposite end of that now, which is that in many cases there is so much data out there that how do you organize it and put it together in a way that actually helps you make a policy decision and not just become overwhelmed by it. In Cook County, for example, one of the things that, and I want to give great shout outs to Tom, the land bank was one of the first participants in the data science for the social good project. And our first project out of the box was around data, and Tom led that, so we really appreciated that. But when you look at Cook County, there are, massive amounts of information that come from the recorder's office, the assessor's office, everything to do with real estate transactions and taxes and pricing. So the question becomes, how do you pull that together and actually make decisions with it? So one of the projects that we worked on with the data science for the social good project was to do something that we've seen in a lot of other places, and it's pretty intuitive, which is make it visual, make people be able to see what you're looking at, because otherwise it's really hard to dial it down. So when we have, our first effort was to take, this vast amount of data and try and turn it into a mapping exercise. And that, I think most of us are, many of us anyway, are visual learners, and it's easy to take in a lot of information that way. And when you start to map a community to say, this is where all the vacant housing is, and layer that onto, this is the vacant lots, and then on top of that, this is what's city-owned, you start to be able to have a conversation that isn't just around liabilities, but around opportunities to move forward. The second way right now that we're thinking about the use of data in the land bank, and I'll give a brief couple seconds on the land bank, and I appreciate the introductions on it. A land bank is a legal entity that's created really to have a single purpose, which is to reduce the amount of vacant housing and vacant land and return it to productive use. There's a couple of other models around the country, and in 2009, as was referred to earlier, when we saw this burst of the housing bubble, we were just doing a triage with people calling the office, looking to get help at court, set up a legal aid process there, and then one of the other problems that became obvious to us is this long time to get title. So if it takes 800 days to get title, it means the house is sitting there vacant for that entire time, and that's never good. We used to have 15,000 foreclosure filings in Cook County on a given year, and we had 15,000 in the pipeline, so things were kind of circulating through. Well, we had a couple of years of 40, 50, 60,000 filings, the same number of judges, and so you just end up with a throughput problem, and you stretch out this time. And so it really started to not only pervert the housing market and make things linger, but it exacerbated a situation of a lower demand for housing in certain communities. So this had been something that had been happening in Chicago for probably a generation or so, because some of the biggest demographic drivers to density in communities had been huge waves of immigration. So basically since the Chicago fire up until maybe the late 60s and 70s, you had real consistent floods of immigration, and they came to certain communities, gateway communities in the city. Well, now we have much lower levels of immigration, and they also go out throughout the entire suburbs, and you could argue into multi-county regions, Will and McCook and others that are not, it's not just you come in through an Ellis Island scenario and come right to the city. So we had these demographic drivers that had created this grid structure in the architecture we have now. Those changed, and a lot of our development was all around how do we replicate the housing density of what we remember as the heyday of these cities. And so when the land bank kind of came into fruition, the idea was to do two things. One, local governments, cities, counties, others have 15 or 20 different responsibilities in relation to land. They have to collect taxes, they have to assess it, they have to police it, pick up the garbage, all of those things. It is easy to get lost from the mission of how am I single-mindedly focused on reducing vacant land and making it productive. But the other thing that I think the land bank can really do, and it's my hope to move this forward, is start a conversation around how do we need to do things differently in the future. And much of that conversation is going to be able to be had in a productive way because we have data. So, one of the things that comes up all the time is demolition. And, it's hard to look at demolition as anything other than bad. It's the death of something, at one point somebody loved this house and it was brand new and they lived in it and it was a wonderful thing, and taking it down is only bad. But if we can talk about shifts in demographics and shifts in population in a way that doesn't make that conversation only about failure and it just makes it about evolution, then all of a sudden people can stop owning some of that feelings of failure and move on to make a right decision. So one of the stats I quote all the time is to say, Englewood, which is it's just west of the university, Englewood has lost 60% of its population since 1960. But Lincoln Park has lost 40% of its population. And a lot of that is driven by the fact that people don't have as big of families anymore. They, appreciate living in a little less dense of a scenario. And so over time, that multiplies into a less dense environment. But nobody says, how's Lincoln Park gonna go on into the next decade? They think, oh, okay, natural, that's how that market evolved. Well, the question becomes, for markets without such a high demand for housing, how do we talk about it to the degree that says, okay, Englewood was a gateway community. It's no longer having floods of immigrants or no longer having people with 8 or 10 kids in their family. How do we come up with a future that just recognizes that world is different? And I think it helps people, like I said, not own that. Another one of the big drivers that we talk about is what happens to the surrounding property values in a community when you take down a house that's blighted. And Cuyahoga County in Cleveland has done an incredible amount of research, a lot of it done out of Case Western, that talks about there's a 7 to 11% increase in property values within 1,000 feet of a home that is blighted and comes down. So you're able to talk about the economic impact and the developmental impact of making a policy decision so it doesn't just look like you're only trying to address a liability, but you're trying to strengthen the assets that remain. I could go on and on about the various examples, but I'll kind of turn it over to these guys, but are happy we can answer more questions later.
I'm going to move up to the podium because that's where the clicker is. All right. Can you all hear me, actually? Okay, good. So the idea behind the Data Science for Social Good Fellowship has always been that bringing together the people at the university with a computational background and the people with a policy background had a lot of potential, that the two communities could learn from each other and be more powerful together than they were on their own. But in fact, what it actually means in reality is that every summer we gather together 40 to 50 people in a room in the loop who don't know anything about the specific subject areas they're being asked to study, and we try to bring them up to speed very quickly. This is our second year now. We've just finished our second year of the Data Science for Social Good Fellowship. And the first year, we were fortunate enough to have Commissioner Gaynor in the Cook County Land Bank as one of our project partners. And I came into that as the mentor for the project, knowing virtually nothing about housing. And it was a bit embarrassing. And so I think over the course of that project, I learned a tremendous amount, and I think it was a very valuable experience. But in the intervening year or so, and over the course of the last summer, when we worked on a bit of a follow-up project with the city of Memphis, I think it sort of helped clarify my ideas about the answer to this question that's placed in front of us, which is, can big data actually help solve the foreclosure crisis? Obviously, I think the answer is yes, but I do want to start with a bit of a caveat, which is that technocratic top-down solutions to neighborhood redevelopment have been tried and have failed over and over again. And so there's really a reason for a healthy skepticism here. And I think nailing down the real ways in which data can actually help and can actually be of use and thinking them through and carrying them through to conclusion is a valuable thing. So I'm going to give sort of 3 points here that where I think data can be of use, and then I'll spend most of my time talking through some examples. The first way is informed decision making, and this is really what we worked on with the Cook County Land Bank last summer, which is how do you take this flood of information from public data, from government agencies, and from private sources, and distill it down into something that's useful for policymakers when they face concrete decisions like which property should I acquire, should I tear them down or rehab them, and so on. The second is operational transparency, and I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that. And then finally, iterative improvement. In other words, impact evaluation and feeding the results of that back into policy, which I know is something near and dear to the heart of a lot of Harris grads. The project that we did last summer involved a lot of knocking on doors. What we did is we went around the city, starting with the Institute for Housing Studies at DePaul University, and then moving on to offices in Cook County and City Hall and elsewhere, begging for data. And the idea is basically that every city agency, every county agency, and even the state and federal level, almost all of them have some data that touches property. And so if you're a government agency that has the goal of bringing property that's distressed or abandoned or vacant back into use, you really ought to be able to have all of that at your fingertips. The government knows these things. You ought to be able to refer to them. And so we knocked on all these doors. We got a lot of data. People were very, almost shockingly cooperative and willing to work with us. And we put a dashboard on top of it to let people sort of take a look at the city from 10,000 feet and then zoom into specific neighborhoods, place them in context, and then even into specific properties and look at some of the vital stats. And this was a useful exercise, but I think the next logical step is really, okay, we have all of these features on every single property in the city and in the county, and let's do something with it, right? Let's distill this down into something that's really perhaps a bit more meaningful than just a list of ownership information and vital statistics and so on. So this is the next step that we took with the city of Memphis this last summer. And we did it in a couple different ways. One of the things that we did, because we were fortunate enough to have a bit of a Rosetta Stone in Memphis, a couple of researchers at the University of Memphis were crazy enough to send surveyors around and look at every single house in the entire city and record its condition, which is truly insane. But I'm really thankful that they did it. Because what it let us do is take these 150 data points or whatever that we had on every single property in the city of Memphis and build a model out of it and be able to say, okay, well, we knew what the ground truth was in 2008 when this survey happened. Let's relate that to the features that the city and the county already keep track of as part of their daily work, administrative data, and build a model that lets us say with, some degree of certainty, okay, this property is likely to be severely distressed. If the land bank acquires this property, it's likely going to require a huge investment to bring it back up. And we were able to validate this because there were neighborhood organizations within Memphis that had done follow-up surveys in 2013, and we were pretty happy with the results. It turns out that if you assess properties for taxes, record tax delinquency, foreclosures, and all this other stuff, you have a pretty good idea of whether a property is being taken care of or not. Sure, the color codes here are actually, the color code is a risk factor for each home in the city. So each parcel is represented by a dot. The red dots are the ones that we believe are greater than 50% likely to be severely distressed, like structural damage, for example, roof caving in. This is a particularly troubled neighborhood in Memphis. It's not a typical picture. And then the green ones are the ones that we believe are probably in a good condition. So we took this data in 2008, built a model from the survey, rolled it forward, and we're able to come up with this risk score, put it on a map, and sort of give policymakers a little bit of a better view at a property level of what's going on in their city. Here's another example. This is the tax increment. associated with a given renovation. So the idea behind property assessment is that it's ultimately based on sales. And so if a community organization takes a home, renovates it, and sells it for a greater amount of money than it was originally assessed for, you're going to get more in taxes back next year. Somewhat notoriously, that's used as a financing scheme for a lot of developments here in Chicago. But the idea is that if you can plug a hypothetical sale into that, if you have a buyer identified for a home that you think you might be able to renovate and hand off to somebody responsible, you ought to know how much additional tax revenue that's going to generate. And so we performed that calculation and again put it in a nice little web tool so that the policymakers in Memphis could actually refer to it. And I think that this is an important point. So big data can be useful, but only if you distill it down into something that when, let's say, Brian White, the executive director of the land bank, is sitting down looking at a portfolio of properties that they can digest pretty quickly. You don't want people to be poring over 10,000 different variables. You want to be able to look at something, assess it as a possible acquisition candidate or not, and move on. And so that's the next step that I think we took with Memphis that is worth carrying further. The next point is operational transparency. And what I mean by this is, right now when we talk about transparency in government, a lot of times one of the points that comes up right away is, well, particularly the city of Chicago and now the Cook County along with other municipalities, they're getting very good about putting administrative data online in the open data portal. But when you think about some of the communities affected most strongly by the housing crisis, these are not necessarily communities where you have massive numbers of people who have the time or capacity to pore over data in the open data portal, draw conclusions from it, and communicate those results to policymakers. Meaningful transparency means actually getting the data in front of the constituents who are affected by policy in a way that they can actually use. And this is, I think, probably the most compelling example I know of from the Chicago area recently. The large lots, dollar lots program that the city prototyped for the last couple of years. This idea grew out of the work of Damon Drummer and some of the technologists in the city, as well as some of the foundations. There were a lot of players involved, and it's a true success story. The idea is that if you have a home in Inglewood or in East Garfield Park, and there's a vacant lot on your block that the city owns, the city doesn't want it. They'd love to hand it off to a responsible homeowner who's invested in the community. And so it's in everybody's interest to turn that over. But the problem is that if you think about how this typically happens, you'd go to the basement of City Hall, fill out a bunch of forms, bring in a documentation, shuffle from office to office getting signatures. Well, in collaboration with LISC and various foundations, a local startup called DataMade created this simple application based on open data where people in Inglewood or in East Garfield Park could pick out a property on their block that they were eligible for, apply for this program with a click of a button, and get a result. And then they did something even more insane. They went into the communities in question and actually talked to people to make sure that it worked, that people knew how to use it, and were able to interact with this in a meaningful way. And they trained people who weren't on how to do the job properly. So the result is huge. 414 applications for lots. It's something like over 50% of the lots in East Garfield Park through this program were applied for. That's a spectacular success. That's operational transparency in the sense that it's more than just putting data up on a portal. It's putting it in front of people in a way that they can use. Interesting. Sorry about that. This is another example of that I think is useful, which is taking citizens and helping them participate in the data generation process. This is from the city of Detroit. Similar story, a startup called Loveland Technologies put up a civic application that was based on open data, but that actually solicited feedback from community members about specific properties and the ways that they could be put back to use. And so not only are citizens able to find out what's going on in their neighborhood, how the tax sale might be affecting them, but they're able to feed back in data, their own local insights that they've gained from having their feet on the ground and walking by these properties every day, and bring that to the attention of policymakers. So similar idea. And finally, the last of my 3 points, and I'll be brief about this because it's difficult and I don't want to generate any hard questions, is iterative learning. And this is, again, something that we tried in Memphis. And the idea is okay, so we have some policy ideas. We think we can renovate homes in certain neighborhoods, demolish homes in certain neighborhoods, and get certain outcomes. We think that property values will go up in some cases. We think that it will help stability, it'll help crime, it'll help all these other metrics that we've identified. But how do we actually test that? And once we do test it, how do we feed those results back in and help the land bank or whatever organization is working on this to improve over time? What we did in Memphis, because we didn't have the good fortune to have enough money or enough time to actually run experiments, is we did a little bit of simple causal inference using a method called propensity score matching, where we sort of constructed ex post facto using administrative data a treatment group, which was a bunch of homes with formerly blighted houses nearby, which were invested in and rehabbed, and compared those to a similarly situated set of homes that did not have a nearby investment, and tried to measure an effect. Are we raising housing prices by rehabbing blighted homes? Not just tax assessments, but actual sales values, actual equity in terms of the people who live in the neighborhood. And because this is a typical talk at a social science gathering, I have to tell you, we need more data. The Memphis housing market moved slowly. There were only 200 sales that we had to consider over the 3 years. And so the effect was positive, as you'd probably expect, but it wasn't statistically significant. Fortunately, Chicago is larger. Fortunately, the land bank is gearing up to do this in a very serious way, and so are a lot of other community organizations. So let's do this, right? Let's assemble the right coalition of academics, technologists, policymakers, and people who understand this problem, and people in the community. And let's see what's working, let's learn from successes and failures, and really make this program work. So that's all I have in terms of slides, so I'll pass it back to Ben.
What does that flag mean with arrows?
So this is a funny slide. I had to put up some kind of map so that I knew what to talk about next. But what this actually is each of those arrows points from a home that was renovated to a home that was not, but is otherwise virtually identical. And the point is that, the point is really that we were comparing homes that were in the same neighborhood, the same environment, even areas that they should be similar in ways that are even difficult to measure with data: social environment, community structure, community cohesiveness, but that saw different outcomes anyway.
Well, thanks so much, Commissioner Gaynor and Tom, for the presentation. I think, I just wanted to start off with a few questions to sort of get us talking, but then I would really like to open it up to the crowd, who I'm sure are inspired and excited to ask more in-depth questions. So Tom, first, you mentioned this idea of sort of boiling things down to something that could be really used as guidance for policymakers, and I mean, we might, in the parlance of economics, sort of call it a sufficient statistic, sort of boiling down this very messy data into a number, or into sort of a thumbs up or a thumbs down, right? Should we, should this property be acquired? Should this property, conditional on acquiring, be demolished or be rehabilitated? What do you think is missing from the data? What do you think is needed? Sort of what's the input that you would need from policymakers to construct something that would be of use along those lines?
I think the hardest question is, what does success look like? Does it look like rising property values? Or in neighborhoods that are concerned about gentrification, is that actually part of a problem, right? And a big part of figuring that question out, figuring out what the metrics of success really are, is going out and talking to people, maybe doing surveys, or maybe engaging with community groups and figuring out, how do we know when something's working, and how do we know what the right things are to measure when deciding which way to proceed? I think that's the most difficult part.
Commissioner Gaynor, did you want to follow up on that question? Or I have other questions for you as well, but do you have a sense of sort of the ways in which we should think about the blending of sort of the policymakers and the data science to construct sort of the most useful thing maybe from the policymaker's perspective, where there's always areas of gray. There's never going to be a hard and fast rule that says if the data says X, we will always do Y, because that's simply not the way that policies are enacted on the ground. What are the kind of inputs that you would look for from the data side to sort of guide policymaking in the context of the land bank or in other contexts?
Well, I think Tom makes a good point, and I referenced it earlier, which is, you know, how is it that we live today and not getting stuck in the past? You know, I think a lot of times we make the same decisions because there's not risk when you do the same thing that's been done before. And so in a policy context, to come up with an idea that's completely different from one that existed before, which is to say, maybe demolition isn't all bad, to your point. Maybe, you know, renovation should be focused on areas of strength and then move outward. Maybe the demand for housing should be something that we can more clearly measure and determine what are the ways in which people want to live today. And I think that so many of the policymakers, myself included, it's hard to distance yourself from your perceptions of what the city is or your perceptions of what a community should be, either from your own personal experience or study or anything else. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that's how people want to live at this moment. And so the large lot program, I think, is a really good example, which is to say people are using this land for something else, and it's improving their quality of life, and in their opinion, it's improving their household and their use of their own space. So how is that not a good thing? But it took us a really long time to get there. There have been that many vacant lots in Englewood for 20 years. So, but it just came about now. So what are the ways that we can, you know, kind of use the data to dislodge our own biases and allow us to make kind of a more reasoned decision?
So Tom, you mentioned at the end that this is something that we should do in Chicago, that essentially we were underpowered to do this study in Memphis, but with Cook County, we could potentially do a similar study. I just wanted to give a plug that I am, in fact, working on grant proposals at the moment to do exactly that study, hopefully with the participation and cooperation of the other panelists. When you're thinking about the challenges that go into doing this type of analysis, I mean, you made it sound like the data acquisition was actually quite easy. I think you undersold some of the effort that you put into that process, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the folks are sort of thinking who are managing this data and the ways in which the data may not necessarily speak to each other, right? We have all spent time, those of you who have gone through the Harris School at least, have spent time wrangling with a data set for an assignment that simply wouldn't do what you wanted to do, and certainly in the real world, you've surely seen that data is messy and rarely agrees with you. So what do you see as sort of the challenges of putting these data sets together, and what do you think you've learned, I guess, from the experience that you were able to then apply maybe more efficiently to the case of Memphis, and this is sort of becoming a more scalable model, something that you're going to be able to farm out as a cottage industry?
Yeah, I think part of the reason why it's attractive to do in Chicago is just because Chicago's big, but part of the reason too is that there's an ecosystem here, that there's connective tissue like Smart Chicago Collaborative and the various foundations that are active in town, and there's open data infrastructure that exists. And really, there's a level of openness surrounding data here that doesn't necessarily fit with the reputation that you hear from outside. So that's part of it is just that the right parties are actually going through the effort to release their data in a way that's usable, which is fantastic. But there are still challenges, and I think the biggest ones are when you're dealing with data that come from different administrative sources, different jurisdictions. So if you're trying to merge data about the city of Chicago that's managed by the city of Chicago with data that's coming from the county, or God forbid the feds, they use different identifiers for everything. You have to, I mean, it's quite painful, to be perfectly honest. And so GIS expertise helps in this. If you can geolocate something, you can probably merge tables. But for the most part, man, like the more that can be accomplished by working within Cook County and by working with people like the Institute for Housing Studies at DePaul who have agonizingly merged these data sets already, I think the better off will be from a practical standpoint, just because it's painful. It's a barrier to entry. For folks who are maybe have far more statistics knowledge than I do, it's a huge barrier to entry to just not be able to even compare these two data sets that are coming from different sources in any sort of coherent way.
So before I turn it over to to the audience, Commissioner Giener, I was wondering if you could just give us a little bit of a sense of where the land bank is right now in terms of acquisition or sort of what stage of the process the land bank is in getting started, and sort of what are some of the early findings from trying to operate this new government entity.
Thanks. So the purpose of the land bank is twofold. As I said, it's got the single focus. Everything that we do goes through the lens of, is this going to take property that's vacant and turn it into productive use? And that productive use can be any one of 10 outcomes. So as long as it fits in that filter, then we go forward. But the other driver for the land bank is, we're not the planning department of the city or the county, and we're, not the building department. We're trying to look at some of the systemic drivers for why the market isn't connecting with each other. So, in a real estate market that was functional and healthy, there really wouldn't be need for the land bank, because land and housing would be moving through the market in a more reasonable pace. And things that were vacant would potentially, long-term vacant, would be because it was a display that there was not really a market for this housing. Well, post the crash, you've seen this mismatch, and there's a couple of different ways that the mismatch shows itself, and ones that we are trying to address. One of them is around financing and the ability to get a mortgage. And it's not just the traditional credit crunches that you hear from, post the crash, banks are more conservative and so they don't want to lend money. It's more the idea that now we have this glut of housing that sat vacant for 2 years because we have this court process that has been incredibly slow. So anyone knows that a home that sits vacant for 2 years decreases in value dramatically, and the longer that goes on, the more dramatic the decrease. There's not a mortgage that exists that if you buy a vacant home and say you buy it for $40,000 and it normally would have sold for 80 or 90, you buy it for 40, but you have to put 50 or 60 into it as a rehab. There's no $80,000 or $90,000 mortgage product that you can buy, that you can get from a bank, because there isn't one backed up by the federal government to say, I'm going to pay this for the acquisition, and then I'm going to pay this for the renovation, and I'm going to end up with my $90,000 house. That doesn't exist. And so one of the things that we've done is we actually did a partnership with Private Bank, who committed $10 million in mortgage capital and has basically created this mortgage product. And they're going to do the working capital loan and then back it out with a mortgage, take themselves out of that piece, and it's going to be into a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. Because the purpose of the land bank is not to become just another source of government activity. It's to bring the market together into alignment and to make the market work in ways that it's just not connecting in a way that it should right now. So it's systemic change that we're addressing. This data and mapping and kind of predictive analytics around housing is another place where we spend a lot of our time. The ability to make information available at the ground level. I mean, you saw the map of Detroit with all the purple dots. Loveland Technologies, for any kind of techno geeks in the room who also like real estate, it's fabulous, and those guys are terrific. They have an app that says, why don't we own this? And people took pictures with their cell phones of houses, and they became geocoded and then entered on to this mapping. What we're trying to do is look at areas of concentration in which there may be a potential for development, but finding the ownership status of a parcel can be onerous and time-consuming. Getting title can be 100 times more that. So, and then clearing off liens for things like water bills and taxes. So if you look at, I mean, even if you just looked at the scavenger properties have been vacant for years, no one's even bought their taxes, there's $400 million in unpaid property taxes. So if somebody looks to assemble a parcel because they want to do development, and then they look and they think, oh my God, it takes 800 days to clear title, and then I'm going to get this vacant land, and it's going to have thousands of dollars in water bills or old property tax liens. Forget it. I'll go do something in the suburbs or in Indiana. I feel like one of our most important missions in this moment right now is to bring somebody to yes on a development decision. And so a lot of what we spend our time doing is, how do we get things into advance? How do we look at clearing those scavenger titles? We're never collecting that money. It's kind of like the banks and the balance sheets they used to have on housing. That day is over. You gotta take the write down for whatever, as hard as it is, and move on to face the future. And the municipalities are no different. They're having this kind of tax on their books that's never going to be collected, but it's an impediment to development. And so a lot of what we're trying to do at the land bank, in addition to addressing certain acquisitions and parcels, and yes, we've acquired housing and all of that stuff, it's also to address some of these other systemic drivers that are getting us stuck. Because if you consider the housing economy to be, this side has endless capital and pretty limitless transactions and tons of health and vigor, and this side has almost no transactions and no interest to capital, the market's willing to go to a certain place. We see our responsibility and our potential opportunity as what can we do to move them that much further? Because you're taking all of that capital and leverage. If you can move them 2 inches, it's more effective than kind of investing in outsized amount of resource in a place where it's very difficult to attract other capital. So those are some of the things that we are focused on and some of the things we've done thus far.
Fantastic. Well, with that, let's turn it over to the audience. If there are any questions, please wait for the microphone to make its way around so that the folks watching this on the internet can hear you.
So this was very impressive in terms of trying to fix the mess, and I guess my question relates to are there big data that suggest how we prevent it from happening again? I think this is just my opinion, but one of the things that seemed to happen was that everyone decided it was great public policy to encourage home ownership. And so Fannie and Freddie, under pressure from the government, because it was viewed as a great thing, encouraged home ownership. Lending standards sank. Bad actors got into the business based on lower standards. And is there any sort of big data in terms of who should own a home and who shouldn't? I guess that's my question, and how do we prevent this from happening again?
I appreciate that point. I think in some ways it was the opposite of that, which is that housing became so valuable. I mean, that $5 trillion that we lost was kind of real. Not all of it was real. So the housing became so valuable, which attracted new people into the market, which were willing to make, riskier bets on capital. The percentage of home ownership in the United States, even during the height of the boom, was only a couple percentage points higher than it consistently has been for the last 30 years and is now. So it's not as if 20% more people got into the home ownership world. It's just that it became such a more attractive investment that it invested. Now, having said that, if anyone is interested in this premise, the book All the Devils Are Here by Bethany McLean, one of the best things I've ever read about Fannie and kind of how we fueled that. As far as how to prevent it in the future, because I think your point is a good one. As the pain of the crash starts to fade, will we kind of adopt those practices in the future? Will you see the interest-only mortgages? Will you see all those things? And, I don't know if I actually have a really good answer other than, remembering how that pattern and having pattern recognition on how to look at it from a regulatory basis. So I don't know if either of you guys have thoughts on that.
Yeah, so when I was at the Federal Reserve, this was something we were quite worried about, avoiding this from happening again, and something that we used in terms of big data. I think there was a real shift from an earlier period where the only people who had the sort of loan level mortgage data that was tracking mortgage performances were the hedge funds, the folks who were buying mortgage-backed securities and trying to price the various tranches of these hedge funds. You've seen a great expansion in terms of access to that data, and in particular, government agencies and regulators are now purchasing that data on a very regular basis and monitoring it closely for changes in lending standards. And so one of the things that I worked on on a research project that sort of folded into policy was looking at county level indices when lending standards appeared to weaken, so sort of relative to the income in a county. When do you see a big increase in the number of loans where people aren't required to make a full 30-year amortizing mortgage payment, right? And that seemed to be a pretty good indicator in certain markets that things were out of whack. And those were the markets where you saw prices really accelerate, especially in the sand states. And so I think there's been a recognition on the part of regulators that buying this data is essential, and that there are some very simple indicators present in that data that are at least a first pass at recognizing when things may be going in the wrong direction.
Hi, sorry. I'm wondering if you can comment on the role, if there's any role for land use or zoning policy, if it's best policy in your opinion to keep these areas as residential, or if big data is suggesting at all that perhaps they should be redeveloped as retail, that there's a need for that in the market, and if that's playing any role.
I don't think big data is suggesting that, or at least I haven't seen any data suggesting it, but I'm personally extremely interested in the question of the kinds of distortions in the market that are caused by land use policies. And one of the interesting things that I got the opportunity to do over the summer was to go down and see the lakeside development, which is proposed to be essentially a new neighborhood. It's down on the south side, about 87th Street in the lakefront. And exactly to your point, there's actually a lot of capital on the south side. It's amazingly underserved in terms of retail. And while that development has a ton of promise and there's a lot of energy behind it right now, it's, I think, suggestive that the very first piece of it that's really coming together is the retail piece. Because in a lot of these distressed neighborhoods, the only option for getting food is at the bodega, the only option for getting clothing is to drive to the north side. I mean, it's a real problem. And I think that the zoning laws, that the way they are, designed as they were back in decades ago, yeah, there's distortions there. It's a real problem.
Thank you. So I was in New York a few months ago for the first time in like 6 or 7 years, and I was struck by how integrated a city New York had become since I had last been there. I don't think I'm out of line here in commenting that Chicago is not a very integrated city, and it's one of the uglier parts about our city. Is there a way we can use housing policy to make it more integrated? And particularly, I'm looking at the stocks of houses that may exist within the land bank.
I guess I'll leave that one to Commissioner Gaynor about the policy response, but I do want to mention that this is another personal interest of mine. Along with land use, segregation in Chicago is one of the things that I've spent a lot of time plotting on maps and thinking about. And although it may not be evident at first glance, things really are getting somewhat better in Chicago, slowly but surely. If you look at the demographic composition of, for example, North Kenwood or Bronzeville right now, you'll see that traditionally, I mean, segregation in Chicago basically meant that white people were only willing to live in white neighborhoods, right? And that is still basically true, but less than it used to be. And you can see that reflected in the data. As you go through and look at these at neighborhoods on the south and west sides in particular that became hyper-segregated during the eras of white flight, the numbers, it's starting from a low baseline, but you really do see people who are willing to consider living in a diverse community or living in a community that's not full of people exactly like themselves, which is encouraging. But how to make that happen more quickly, I'll leave that to you.
I'll answer the question. I don't know if I can. I think that the constraint with housing that becomes owned by the land bank is it's in weak market communities, which tend to be less integrated. And so, and until you can kind of create the attractive and quality of life drivers, they're still weak market communities. And so people with options, black or white or Latino, end up often choosing because they can. And so I think part of the, I don't really have a good answer for that question. I think that it's something that the question is, how do you create amenities in every community that make it attractive? And as far as the retail space, that's less of my area of expertise. But I do think that retail can be the first foray because it can attract, people don't have to make a 30-year investment decision to use retail. And so how do you use that as a draw and a lure into communities?
Hi, hello. Thanks for coming out tonight. This was very interesting. So oftentimes we're making decisions, they're based on facts, but also opinion. So as we're talking about data, I just start to think a bit more about predatory lending and how that's affected certain communities in the past, especially if I'm thinking about Inglewood, given the makeup of minority inhabitants of that area, I would assume that they're probably hit by predatory lending far more than people would be if they were living in Lincoln Park. How can we use this data to not only address the policy making, but also the implementation, especially when it comes to banks and trying to meet the market at equilibrium?
I think you kind of addressed this, Ben, when you talked about the ability to track the types of loans that were happening in communities.
That's right.
You know, I mean, I think when I remember the discussions around this topic about 10 years ago in Chicago, you know, if we look back and I think study our municipal history from the last 15 to 20 years, we are not always going to be proud of the decisions we made in regards to the regulation of predatory lending. And there was a phrase that was a lot more common than I hear it now, which is like the unbanked. How do you get people to engage with banks? And there was this idea, especially in some of the more robust financial times, that having people engage with a financial institution was net better than not at all. We learned the hard way that that wasn't always the case. And while some credit can be priced riskier, where do you draw that line that says, okay, this is risky in acknowledgement of the risk, and this is just risky predatory? It's a very clear thing to say that people who lived in communities of color, communities of lower income, had more, you know, just what's in front of them is, you know, kind of non-standard financial institutions and ones that relied on higher and up to predatory interest lending. But I think that, you know, I actually wrote that down. It was a really interesting point about how quickly can we track the trends of the types of loans that are being made in communities, and not even just by county, but even boiling that down to communities, cities, municipalities, suburbs, and looking at staying on top of that. And I think that the difference in the conversation now about predatory lending is we've come out the other side of it and realized how rapacious it really is, as opposed to thinking, you know, we were just one step down that continuum of reaching out to a population that had not been banked before.
So, a few years ago, I happened to hear a wonderful architecture professor at IIT speak about some of the challenges on the South Side. And some of the issues have to do with very historical repercussions, such as lot size. So one of the things that's interesting is that the land bank, in terms of its redistribution of lots, has done nothing to change the fundamentals of parcels. And there's a lot of, you know, urban development issues that relate to, if you were to change the landscape and the representation, which of course is a big data classic, right? How you change the representation of the model changes the outcome. So my question is whether, in fact, anybody has done enough work to really look at additional variables beyond just the housing market classic conditions, to look at things that might also be changed that are within the limits of the land bank to create progress.
Yeah, Commissioner Gaynor and I looked at each other and smiled because I think the same gentleman gave a talk at a land bank board meeting that we were both at.
Marshall Brown, maybe for those.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the city of Cleveland and the county of Cuyahoga have been, I think, one of the leading practitioners of land banking. And this is one of the major things that they do, is they combine parcels into larger, more developable lots. I'm trying to, this is really a question that could be addressed with data, and so I'm hesitant to bring personal opinions into it, but my personal opinion is that Washington Park, which is the neighborhood that Marshall Brown talks about, is served by a tremendous amount of historically expensive and public infrastructure, things like the Green Line and the Red Line and Cottage Grove Avenue and the Dan Ryan Expressway and all these other things. It's zoned, unlike so many neighborhoods in Chicago, for dense mixed-use development. It would be a bit of a shame during a time when mixed-use core neighborhoods within cities are coming back at a remarkable rate to turn one of them into a suburb within the city, in my opinion.
I'll just add one more thing onto that, because I think that So Marshall Brown's work, he's a professor and an architect at IIT, fantastic guy, he's really interesting. And one of the things he suggests in a place with a lot of vacant lots and less buildings is, do you really need to maintain this grid that Chicago's so famous for? So the sidewalks need to be here and the streets need to be here, and then, it goes in these rows, and if there are things missing in the middle, it looks like a gap tooth. But when you look at the density of Washington Park, it's similar to the density of River Forest, which is a suburb just west of here and quite, middle class to affluent. And is density this driver that we always talk about, like that's our version of success? And both of these guys have referred to, how do you define success when you're going to planning? So could you kind of strip away the grid structure and get rid of what they call terminal vista, like you look at a street and you can see all the way to downtown, and make curving streets and kind of curve around the buildings as they exist? I mean, he's done an interesting thing about looking where do people actually walk versus where the sidewalk is. So look, I'm all game for creative thinking, because in a mode where you're unlikely to see anything more than a modest degree of development in a community for the foreseeable future, why not mix it up and do something different and make it more pleasing for the people that are living there now? And also give people examples of why everything that we do doesn't have to be replicating the past.
We have time for one more question.
I recently read a short piece in the New Yorker about Utah's success with the Housing First program and the Rapid Rehousing Initiative that has drastically reduced both chronic homelessness and recently homeless families in the state over the past several years. And I know it's departing somewhat from the premise of this talk, but I was wondering if big data and or the land bank could use these tools that we've been discussing this evening to combat those problems.
Of homelessness?
Yes. I don't know if everyone is familiar with those programs, but they deal with rehousing.
Is this because we're at U of C and you're pimping me with a New Yorker article that I haven't read? No?
Unintended. But maybe.
I'll give you one kind of piece of data, and I am an alum, not of the Harris School, but so I can say that amongst friends. One of the interesting things in New York, so the Department of Homeless Services in New York City has started tracking evictions and using a few other metrics to determine what are the attributes of an eviction that leads to greater homelessness and is more likely, and how do you have services right there at the eviction to address that. So that's one way to think about the data connection to it. But I'll tell you, it haunts me sometimes as I think about the incredibly intuitive connection between empty houses and people without homes. And how do you take this extremely basic thought and make it move together? And so those are the things, and like lots of simple ideas that are incredibly elegant. It's a lot more complicated in the detail. But I think the decisions around being thoughtful about how we invest our resources for rehab and start in a place where there's some assets and kind of build from there and create those opportunities are the best way, to kind of address that place where, we referred to the market mismatches earlier. Well, this is a market mismatch too. There's a human need and a social need, and there's an asset existing, but they're not connecting with each other. How do we do that? It's something that drives us constantly. We're not at that moment right now because we're tending to deal more with vacant housing, can it be rehabbed and sold? But it's certainly something that bears, and deserves a lot more thought and study.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Any closing
Yeah,
thoughts?
no, well, I think if we learned one thing, everybody needs to go home and read their New Yorker back issues immediately. So to prepare for the next Harris lecture, so everybody get right on that. Please join me in giving a big round of applause to our panelists. Thank you so much.